I use that and give an elevator pitch for calculation groups or on calculation groups. Let me just try and make this quick. So a lot of people know me. The other ones can look into the slides. My social media contacts are there as well. I want to talk a little bit about what calculation groups actually are, how to build them, and when actually to use calculation groups, or maybe when not to use them. That might be as interesting as well. So calculation groups. Calculation groups are actually meant to close a big gap between Azure Analysis Services tabular mode functionality and multidimensional functionality. In multidimensional, one of the most important and most powerful features were scoped assignments that allowed you to really define calculation logic, business logic that could be applied very flexibly. Of course, in Analysis Services tabular mode, as well as Power BI, which is based on the same technology, you can use DAX to actually define business logic very flexibly, but it's really hard to reuse that. So if, for example, you want to create a measure, you define the logic for that individual measure, but if you want to reuse the same calculation logic for another measure, you need to rewrite it. And calculation groups are actually meant to solve that problem and to close that gap. So actually a calculation group, which is represented as a table in the model with actually two columns, one column for the calculation items and another column for the sorting of those items. So those calculation groups contain a set of calculation items, and you can define each calculation item individually. You can name that item. As I said, you can sort those items, and each item contains a calculation rule. It's a DAX expression that can be applied to different measures. And by this, you can reuse the calculation rule that you defined in that calculation item. Apart from that, you can define dynamic format strings for this calculation items. So by this, you can actually decide how the results will be formatted when the calculation item is actually applied. Yeah, and there you already have the dynamic part. It's applied based on a DAX expression that you define in this format string. So you can really say something like, if condition 1 applies, then use this kind of format string. If condition 2 applies, use another one. And calculation groups are available in Analysis Services 2019, Azure Analysis Services, and Power BI datasets, but only in Power BI Service, not in Power BI Report Server. Some things worth knowing about calculation group. You can implement several calculation groups per model. If so, you might remember, especially if you worked with Analysis Services multidimensional in the past, that if you define different calculation rules, the order of execution might be pretty important. So solve order was the part that was actually used, or the configuration that was used in multidimensional. With calculation groups, you also have a possibility to define the order of execution for the several calculation groups. And what you can do as well, you can reuse calculation items. So you cannot only create calculation item to reuse the logic, but you can reuse calculation items in defining the logic for other calculation items. I'm actually saying here shown in the demos, but I won't manage to do that, or I'll just show you the result. So yeah, let's see this. What you cannot do is you cannot define object or row level security based on calculation groups. So this is one of the limitations you should be aware of. And Important if you're working with Power BI, if you're setting up Power BI models, then typically models are set up using implicit measures, which means all the numeric columns, for example, are treated as implicit measures. So that is why you can just drag and drop a numerical column onto the canvas and it will do a calculation on top. Typically in analysis services, explicit measures are preferred. So you're really writing a measure string saying measure A does sum of this column. And if you're creating calculation groups inside your model, this setting is actually set automatically. So the usage of implicit measures will be prevented afterwards. That is very important to know if you start using calculation groups in Power BI. Challenges, the sideways recursion, that is what I already mentioned. So you can reuse calculation items in the definition of other calculation items. That can get quite complex. And the precedence, this is the proper order of execution. This is applied to business logic and formatting, so you should pay attention to this. How to build that? So it's really hard in 10 minutes to show you a lot. So I will just quickly show you where to do this. So for analysis services, you're typically using Visual Studio. So here in the Tabular Model Explorer in Visual Studio, you have the possibility to create calculation groups. You can rename them. You see the columns and the calculation items inside, and you can define the sort order. But what I would like to show you is how to do that in Power BI, because Power BI Desktop can display already created calculation groups. So all of those three are calculation groups, but there is no way to create them, to define them, or even to edit them. So even if you're looking here, you're seeing the columns, but you don't have any way of creating or changing anything. To do this, you need to use Tabular Editor. And in Tabular Editor, if you see the same thing, here you have the possibility to create calculation groups, and you can actually look into the definition and define each and every calculation item. And here again, you see the properties I just talked about. So you can define the sorting using the ordinal of each calculation item. And on calculation group basis, you can define the precedence, which is the sort order of execution. And inside the calculation items, you have the possibility to use sideways recursion. So if I want to create the month-to-date value of the previous year, I can use a formula to create the month-to-date value and apply the to create the previous year value and apply the month-to-date calculation from the same calculation group. So reuse other calculation items. You can only use one calculation item of each calculation group per filter context. So normally per calculate statement. But if I would do something like year-over-year percentage, where I'm using a divide, I can reuse one calculation item per calculate. And the results will look something like this. So if, for example, I'm using time intelligence, I can use different measures and I can apply different calculation items to those measures. And as you can see, if I add the year to date, for example, this is applied to all the measures in selection. This is actually caused by using certain DAX formulas like selected measure. You already quickly saw some of the use cases I mentioned. So it's especially when you want to use reoccurring calculations like currency conversion or time aggregations, or if you need to use flexible formatting options. So for example, just looking back at the currency conversion, if you want to have each currency formatted with the currency symbol, that is something which you can use calculation groups for. Because, just to say, the alternative for dynamic formatting would be using the format function in DAX, which will return a string, and therefore measures using the format functions cannot be used in charts. Issues, if you want to use it for object or row level security, you cannot use it for detail rows, expressions, or smart narrative. I already mentioned the implicit measures. And very important, if you define dynamic format strings and you're using reports created with the Power BI dataset connection against this dataset, report level measures created inside the report will not consider the dynamic format strings. So that is an issue. And if you want to create measures that avoid actually the calculation groups, that is something which you need to actually consider when creating this. So there are some reasons for and some reasons against this. And yeah, just let's say, I think when it came up, it looked a little bit like a Swiss Army knife. But sometimes if you're really having to work with this a little bit more, it gets to look more like rocket science to get everything up and running. But I'm still a big fan because it's really helping maintenance and rework and reusability, or to reduce maintenance work and to keep reusability up. With this, thank you for your time, and yeah, have a good rest of the day.